Sophie Spital, welcome to The Next Generation.
Thanks, babe.
What does it mean to have a life built on the foundations of rotten bricks?
Well, this is something we were just talking about, and we've been workshopping together as an idea, isn't it? Everyone has a set of principles and values that undergird their life, even if they don't know that they're building it. And we would say that rotten bricks are things that we allow that are not good, that compromise.
Can bricks be rotten?
Yeah, well, that's where it all falls down, doesn't it? Literally. No, but yeah, so yeah, it needs a bit of work, I think. But the idea that there are things that you do that you might not even be happy with, and you think, that's not great, but for some reason you compromise because it's expedient for you to, I don't know, cut a corner or do something you think is morally not great, but you're like, okay, but I want to reach this level. And the thing is that if you build your life on a foundation and you put in bricks along the way that are compromises, that eventually catches up with you and it does weaken the foundation. And so we were talking about how it's incumbent upon everyone to sort of self-reflect and think about am I making compromises along the way of my life, and actively removing those. And you can look at that from a utilitarian perspective, such as, well, obviously it's, if you're going to have negative things, then ultimately you could say, oh, well, then it's going to collapse even like a normal building. And so you would be wise from a utilitarian perspective to just not put those in there. But also, I think from a broader moral perspective, it's important to not have those bricks there, even if no one ever finds out, even if you get away with it, as it were.
Why not?
Well, every single conversation I have with you always ends up with the same thing, which is
if there's a God.
Yeah. I always say every question is theological. So basically every quandary, every moral question, every philosophical question depends on whether there's a God or not, whether there's a moral lawgiver or not. So obviously, if there is a God and there is objective morality, then we do need to think seriously about the fact that there is right and wrong and choosing right and wrong in the world.
Do you think there's an argument to remove the rotten bricks from your life, even if there isn't objective morality? Because I'm very suspicious of that. I don't know that there is necessarily.
Yeah.
We constantly have this back and forth, and oftentimes I might say something that's very much utilitarian in the form of, this would be the most efficient thing to do.
Yeah.
And you pull me up and say, it doesn't matter if it's the most efficient thing to do, it's not moral. But even someone like me who maybe doesn't necessarily believe in objective morality, is there a way of steel manning this argument even for me?
Well, yeah, I did just sort of allude to it in the sense that, Dr. Peterson, giving this due respect, does talk about this, and says that you don't get away with anything, and even from just a psychological perspective. But I would say that while that's true, it does feed back into the broader question of why that's true. And I would say that that's true from a utilitarian perspective because we exist in a world where that's kind of a law of nature that a Christian would say is a natural law that's sort of built into the way that God has created things, so that you can't. That's just if we rail against that, we're basically just railing against reality, and we think, oh, I can. This is essentially, so we're talking about rotten bricks, but essentially what we're talking about is sin, which is to say doing things that aren't, they're outside of what God prescribes for a life of goodness, morality, and thriving and worship of Him. And so these things, these compromises, they're things that eventuate even if you say, oh, I don't believe in God, or even, let's say, not God, but even if you say, oh, I don't believe that the world is like that, reality is still going to react in that way. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I love this reframing of it, and I find it so hard as someone who doesn't believe in God to have that real moral grounding, because if you don't have that grounding in something divine, you're essentially just making up the rules as you go, right? And that's very dangerous, because then you can fall victim to your emotions and your impulses convincing you that something's the right thing to do, even if it isn't. And Constantine, our old boss, told me this a long time ago, and it was that smart people are even more likely to be able to reason themselves into doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
because you're good at reasoning.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've been thinking about all year long since he told me that, and it's been so helpful. I've even just stopped myself from reaching for the bag of cookies on top of the cupboard, and I'm reasoning myself, oh, but it's this time of the day and I hit a really good workout, and it's like, no, you're just caving into your impulses, and all of this reasoning in your brain that seems to come downstream from logic is actually just downstream from the emotions that you're feeling in that moment. So if you can just pause, I've seen people even just recommend that you should count to 10 and then everything will be different. So I love this analogy that we do need to work on, because I don't know if run bricks are a thing, but this real practical implementation you can put in your life of analyzing every little thing that you do and thinking, is this building up my house to fall down later down the line?
Yeah.
Or is it putting in place solid bricks that are going to build me up to be the biggest, strongest person I can be and best person?
Yeah.
And again, that visual of the brick is that you might not necessarily see that it's rotten, and when you've got 100 other bricks floating about, it might seem fine, but eventually it will erode and screw you over.
Yeah.
Do you think that people putting rotten bricks into their lives and taking the easy route is more prevalent nowadays, or are we just more aware of it because of technology?
I think humanity's always been the same. I think there's always a tendency to reach for the shortcut, for the kind of thing that is dodgy, but you kind of justify it to yourself, as you say, anyway. And again, that would be what Christians refer to as sin. And ultimately, I'd say that, I mean, this is really getting theological, I suppose. But as I say, everything's theological.
Go for it.
Just hit the mic. So this idea that what actually is sin, and the idea of sin in the Bible is this. I would say that fundamentally all sin is, or all sin leads back to, is a distrust that God is good and that he has what he prescribes is actually worthy of trust. Or rather, it's a really wordy way of saying, I don't trust that God is good. And you can, and I mean, that sounds very abstract. You say, oh, every sin. But like, if you think about it, for example, if you're stealing something, it's because you're thinking, I know that stealing's wrong, but I need to shore up my sense of security because I don't believe that God is good enough to provide for me. And so there's this fundamental resistance of the idea that there is a God and that he is able to provide. And I think that is the same on social media, or, I mean, because you look at what are they, so we talk about everyone having a foundation, everyone's building on something, but what values lie at the foundation of that? Because one would say, well, I would say, Christianity would say that people are either building their own empire or they're helping build God's empire, God's kingdom, right? And so as long as you're building your own kingdom, you are going to be inward looking, and you're going to be more prone to putting those bricks in because you're thinking, like we were just talking, we can't name names about, someone we know, but just making compromises, even though, it's just like, this isn't a good thing to do from an ethical perspective, but from a business perspective, you could say, oh, well, the incentive is there. You said, how do we even know these bricks are there? But the thing is, the more bricks you put in, the less you notice them. And if you've got one brick, you can be like, that's not good, I need to remove that. And so there's a principle, well, Christ says, if you're faithful with the little, you're faithful with the lot. And that's why I'm always banging on about like integrity in the small things, like really small things. Like, like if you can get out of like buying a ticket for something and just sneaking in, but it as a Christian, like there have been times when I've gotten through something, or I've realized that I can sort of swerve the system, and then I'm like, I feel convicted is a Chryso word for it, but like you feel like that's not right, and then you you say, okay, fine, I'll go back and I'll buy the ticket even though the barrier was like broken or something. And that's the sort of thing that's like faithful with the little, faithful with the lot. And that's not to say that Chrysos obviously are not perfect, but I think there's an intentionality about looking at where are those rotten bricks and pulling them out. And the reason we were talking about this initially was because I was commending you for someone, even though you're not explicitly religious, although that's
not religious.
Yeah, okay, fine. You're not religious, but I don't think you're an atheist either, as you said in your interview with that American guy. But I know that you would sort of consider yourself agnostic or whatever. But even what I'm saying is you don't prescribe to a certain religious like value system necessarily, but you're still quite, up for being challenged. And you asked me to be your, what is it, chief rotten brick investigator or something.
Chief rotten brick officer.
Yeah. Because and one of the things I love about you, obviously we're friends and this goes back, but like, is that you have integrity, and I've seen you make decisions and make sacrifices based on ethical reasoning that other people would just be happy to let slide. And I don't think, maybe you are doing it from a purely utilitarian, standpoint, but I don't get that sense, and I get the sense that you do want to remove those things and build a good foundation. And I think this is what you're doing with the show, is like, you always talk about like getting it right, like laying really strong, like robust foundations on good values, so that, because everything else builds from there. So you have to get the foundation right.
But at the same time, I think you do need the carrot and the stick. So the stick in this situation is the utilitarian argument that even if you don't care about others and you're doing it purely for a self-serving reason, you are going to fuck yourself over if you are constantly lying. You're not going to be able to keep track of your lies. You're going to do something wrong. You're going to piss off a lot of people. You're not going to get the same opportunities. So I think I'm trying to make sense of this analogy and be able to convince people my age that aren't religious, because that's what's needed the most. If someone's Christian, they don't need to be convinced of this because it's baked into the religion. Whereas I guess the question is, how do we transfer this over to people that don't have that baked into their lifestyle? And
you want to have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly. I always want my cake and I want to eat it too.
You always want the cake.
So I think you need both that push and pull factor, the pull of being gracious and doing the right thing. And I think I have that. You spoke for me, and I'm happy you did, saying that I don't just do it from a utilitarian perspective, because I do genuinely believe that some things are just inherently wrong, no matter if anyone notices or whatever. But also I am aware that it's going to benefit me having those morals.
I suppose that's the best you can do from a secular perspective. Sorry if that's patronizing. But I mean, I guess the question is, why wouldn't you follow that through to its logical endpoint, in the sense of, I mean, we're really getting into the territory of well, the question of morality and whether it's subjective or objective, or why we even choose good things in the, if it's not explicitly, because sometimes there are things that you choose that are moral and they do have a negative outcome. And from a just perspective, looking on, you say, why would you do this? Because it can only like destroy your life. For example, standing up for something in the workplace. Obviously on Trig, having worked on Trig, we've had loads of guests pass through who've been, cancelled or fired or whatever because they've made a stand for great things like, Maya Forstata and, or just free speech or freedom of religion and stuff. But there are some things that it's all well and good for those people, I suppose, but there's a lot of people who step out, get fired, and ruin their lives over a principle, ruin their lives. Now, I would argue that, so if you think this life is the only life, there's less incentive to do that, because it's like, well, I've only got one life. I want to keep it secure. I want to keep it like, I'm not going to make that call. I'm going to let someone else fight that fight because I've got to shore up my own life. And I'm not. I get that it's difficult, but I think if you look at people like through history who've made these big kind of moves towards moral progress like William Wilberforce or Martin Luther King Jr. and all these people, these kind of steps of speaking out about something and getting in trouble for it. A lot of people, it is ironic actually, because people say, oh, Christians, they don't really, they just kind of stay in their own world because they're like, oh, it's okay, I'm going to go to heaven one day. But it's actually the opposite, which is that if you believe that life is eternal and there's other things, then you are less like attached to, your life right here and right now. Do you see what I mean? And you're more willing to be a martyr, as it were, whether that's like, there's a lot of martyrs around the world right now, like actual martyrs, and there are people making stands for, things like, an end to abortion and stuff like that. Oh, hot potato. But the things that are sacrificial, and they come out from that place of not needing like to desperately secure your life down, because their end goal isn't the point of my life is security and happiness and comfort. The point of my life is something bigger, and that can mean sacrifice and suffering at times.
But flesh that out with me, because I don't necessarily believe in an afterlife, but I still very much commit to this quote. It's actually from Gladiator. What a film to quote from. But they say that these gladiators, they're about to go out and fight, and they want to go out with valor. They don't just want to be left cowering in the corner and die a pussy. So the main guy gives this speech, and he's like, what we do here in life echoes through eternity. And I know that's a trivial Hollywood quote, but I very much resonate with that, and that's how I live my life. And I would be willing to be a martyr because I'm aware of the fact that, or at least in my belief, that this is my only life. And what I do on this planet echoes through eternity and to other people and impacts the world, even if it's in the smallest of senses or in the biggest of senses. So I don't necessarily know if that's true, that only sort of Chrisos can have that.
I'm not saying it's only Chrisos. I'm not saying it's only Chrisos. I'm just saying that they're more likely, because I think their goal of what life is aimed at is different, or rather it should be, if they're really following Christ. Because Christ talked about, you pick up your cross and you follow me, and he says in this life you will have trouble, and there's a real expectation amongst Christians that they will face suffering, they'll face trouble. Whereas, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the one that's in the Gen Z chat and everything, but like what I see on social media and just around me is like the aim of my life is to be, I don't know, successful or known, like have followers, or okay, maybe that's just a little bit influency, but I just mean like just general life. It's like, it's about getting to a level of comfort and security that I can sort of live out my days without too much like stress coming in. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that.
But where does that come from is the question.
What do you mean?
Where does that feeling of wanting to be an influencer come from? I think it comes from everyone's fear of inevitable death and wanting to do something with their life. And actually they're sort of, I guess it goes into this theory of terror management, where there's this idea that people do everything just because they're scared of death, and they're putting it off, whether it's creating art or filming documentaries or starting up a podcast. And I almost feel like, even though it's shallow on the surface, these influencers just doing things for the sake of it and flogging products that they don't even use, like fucking charcoal toothpaste, I feel like maybe it does lead back to something deeper, and we need to find that reason and switch tact and realize that being an influencer doesn't get you to that reason. You need to do something else that gives you purpose. So I think that maybe some people are influencers and they're documenting their life purely because they do want to live this great life that will be remembered, and they're scared of death. But actually it comes across as this super shallow thing, pleasure seeking, just looking for followers and clout. And maybe that's true on the surface, but actually I think that everyone is longing for a bit more purpose and meaning.
There's a dichotomy there, which is that in Christianity, there's an insistence that you're at once worth everything. Like you're made in the image of God. I'm talking about an individual human. Made in the image of God, that you carry great dignity, that you should be, regardless of your economic worth or your status or anything, your intelligence, you are worth, protecting and valuing to the, same extent as everyone. And there's a really, really high value on human life, but there's also an insistence that you are, in a sense, that you're nothing. So you're like everything and you're nothing, in the sense that before God, we are to humble ourselves. We can't just lift ourselves up and say, tell God the things we want and, demand things of him, and that we are kind of like ashes and vapor and things like that. I mean, the Bible describes human beings as. So there's a strange thing. It's like, so we need to know our worth, need to have dignity for ourselves. But we also need to be humble, and that's a strange thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, going back to this point about having dignity, that you've discussed earlier about doing the right thing no matter what. Yeah. Let's take the train ticket example.
Yeah.
How do you square that with maybe sometimes you're living in a corrupt society that's set out the wrong rules for you, so to abide by those rules isn't necessarily living with dignity. So let's say the train company is corrupt and they're spending the money on, I don't know, building some prison for a certain group of people.
Yeah.
Is it moral then to ditch the train ticket if you need to get to work?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a better example, because I think there are things like that in society. You could say, well, I don't know, giving to a certain charity, but the charity is corrupt and captured by a certain ideology that you really don't agree with. I mean that's a real that's a genuine question for Christians. I think there probably aren't too many things that we engage with. I might be completely wrong, but off the top of my head, I can't think of too many things that we engage with that we would actually have that moral choice day to day. Because I think most of the time you would vote with your feet and say, well, I'm not going to, buy that brand, or I'm not going to give to that charity. I'm going to give to this charity instead. Or what was the example you used? The train
buying
company.
The train ticket, but the train company spending the money on building up a prison for a minority group.
Yeah, I think in that case, I would just not use that train company.
But what if you're going to work and your work is against the imprisonment of minority groups, so you need to get the train?
I think this is a perfect example of the thing of being faithful with the little, and then you're faithful with the lot. Mm-hmm. Because I actually think, so the Chryso life, it could seem like a really difficult way of living, and in a sense it's another strange dichotomy, because in a sense it is, but in a sense it isn't, because there's this thing, well, what I've kind of boiled life down to is follow Christ and let the chips fall where they may. So, or you could say do the right thing and then accept what comes next, because most of our sinful decisions like that are like, well, I don't want to do that, but I need to do that, and so the means justify the end. It's like, well, if you just say I'm not going to do something that I'm not comfortable with, then let's say, well, the only way of getting to this particular job is, I don't know, it's out on an island, this anti-slavery charity, and you have to get this boat, but the boat is owned by someone who also does human trafficking or whatever, and that's the only way you can get there. Well, then you'd say, look, I can't use this boat, therefore I can't have this job. Or there'll be another way around it. But then, from a Christian perspective, God honours all of those decisions, so he would open up opportunities for you elsewhere, and that's how I live my life, and that's a lot of Christians live their life, and that does give you complete freedom, because I'm convinced, because I believe God exists, I'm convinced that number one, he's bigger than all of these things. So again, you don't have to be like, oh, but if I miss that opportunity, that I'm screwed. But it's just no, God always honors that, and he always provides if you stay on his straight and narrow. And that's what I've experienced actually, from turning things down because of a value that I have. And I found that, it could sound a bit twee, but it's true. And it's my experience, that, God, opens a door elsewhere, and he does provide. Again, from a non-Christian perspective, well, that's just life. That's just what happens. It's like, okay, fine, but it doesn't stop me from living that way. And I think that's an easier way to live. Sacrificial at times, but as I say, if you keep sacrificing little things, then you won't get yourself into a situation when you're really, really you have to tell a big lie or something. Do you know what I mean? Because lies compound.
I'm glad we've fleshed this out, because we seem to have found the disconnect. And that's that when you stop yourself from even going to that island to do your job that's against slavery, to me, it's illogical and irrational to not go to that job anyway if you're creating, better good.
But that's not the only thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is the thing. So there'll be enough people to not take that boat, and then someone else will be like, look, this is corrupt. I'm going to start a new charity that does this without the human trafficking. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's not, you love to give me little like, what if this, what if that? But like in reality, like there is usually more than a binary choice.
Yeah. Well, I think what it comes down to is in that situation, you have faith that everything's going to turn out okay.
Yeah.
Whereas me living in a world without God, I'm responsible for myself, and there's no one sort of looking out for me that will make sure that everything's okay. So I will take the option sometimes that seems to work out and is more logical immediately.
Yeah, which is what the Bible calls sin.
Long term. Well, it's interesting, that concept of sin. And when you say that word, it sort of pricks my ears up because it's a horrible word.
Yeah.
But the initial translation for sin was actually just missing the target, right?
Yeah.
In ancient Greek?
I'm not sure of the derivation,
but so it was very different
missing
to the framing
mark,
now, which is this horrible thing that you're going to burn in hell for.
Yeah.
Actually, the original definition of sin was just missing the mark.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, I don't think you can chalk it all up to that because, I'm no theologian, though I pretend to be when I'm like arguing with you, but like there isn't just like one kind of version of sin. I mean, the Bible talks about different kinds of sin. So there's a sin that you might do, like if I slapped you right now, that would be, I would never slap at your lovely face, but that would be a sin, right? And then there's the sin. Then there's the Bible talks about at the fall, as it were. The Bible talks about at the fall of man, whether you believe that allegorically or literally in terms of Adam and Eve and everything. It says that God subjected creation and everything to fall under almost like a blanket of sin. So it's a kind of a brokenness, a sort of the waters that we all swim in, which is all around us and has affected like our temptations, the things that we that are kind of in our nature, you could say, which is what we call like original sin. This idea that we're full of impulses and instincts that are not good, and this is an interesting thing because again, you sort of mentioned it in the car when we drove here, but there is this presupposition that if something is naturally occurring in the human being, that it's good, which I don't know. First of all, Christian would obviously say that's not the case, but even from a secular perspective, there's no reason to say that. And so, because we're all filled with instincts all the time, and a lot of those instincts are sinful, even if we don't move towards them.
Joe, this is so true and so important. We live our lives nowadays, from my experience with Gen Z, assuming that everything we instinctively feel is true and correct. And there's a logical grounding in that because you're told to trust your gut, as it often knows more than you know consciously at any moment, which is true to a certain extent. Yeah. But a lot of the time we are just won over by our impulses and we ground in this thing that it must be true. Yeah.
I mean, there's a great, I think it's a Babylon Bee thing, or certainly it's a meme or something, and it's a headline and it's got a picture of Adam and Eve with the apple, and it says like, couple follows their heart, 6 billion dead or something. It's like this idea that following your heart is the most like important thing. Obviously, I mean, you could frame that in so many ways, because it's such a modern and bizarre idea that following your heart should be your heart. So this is so different, culturally different from Christianity, because in Jeremiah, I think it is, the Bible says that it says that the heart is wicked and deceitful beyond all things. Who can understand it? It's like it's actually saying the heart is actually deceitful and going after things that are wrong, and that you shouldn't trust it. It's literally the polar opposite of what the world says, or at least the current world. And I think this is why we're seeing so much of a crisis at the moment, because especially your generation, like they think that the solutions, or at least they're told the solutions for their life, are found within. And it's like you look within for answers, you look within for your identity. It's all in you. You are enough. You've just got to find it. Whereas I would say that you're not enough, actually. There isn't actually, maybe, I know from my own experience, and I think an honest look inside oneself will reveal that there is a lot of bad stuff in there. And it's, we're sublimating a lot of bad desires a lot of the time. And I think, I don't want to get too it's not graphic, but...
Tell us about your foot fetish.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to go on to. Genuinely though, I was actually going to bring up porn because, or is that, do I have to use a special word so you don't get demonetized? Corn?
Corn.
Yeah.
Just say porn. Fucking corn.
Yeah, no, but seriously, so this is what I was talking about in terms of, if you engage in porn, obviously it spirals into depravity very, very quickly. And most people that are consuming porn, they're not just watching a happily married couple having just normal sex. Do you know what I mean? It may start like that, probably not, but it's going to descend and get more and more depraved. And it's and people, you can approach that and be ashamed of it and be I don't, and know that that's bad, or you can rationalize it and say, oh no, it's fine, it's just an animal instinct, whatever. But we all know the depravity that our mind and heart can go towards if we let it, if we don't control it, if we don't have discipline over ourselves. And that's just one area, but we're always, full of instincts that are bad. And so this mental idea that looking within would yield anything, it's only good. Okay, there are good things to be found, actually, because, as I say, we are made in the image of God. There are genuinely good things and good gifts that we are to walk in and we can use in our lives. But it's not only good. It's not only the source of identity. And I think that if you are finding your identity inside, there's a real kind of pressure. I think this is why we've got all this identity crisis in terms of people identifying as more and more kind of, distinct little subsets of, gender fluid, demi boy. I'm not making fun of it. But the categories grow and grow and grow, because it's that sense of I really need to define myself. I really need to know exactly who I am, my identity. And I don't think that, I think that it just seems to come from an insecurity. I remember that when I was your age, literally when I was your age, which was a long time ago, baby. I put my identity in so many things. Actually, it's really interesting. I never told you this. But yeah, I was obsessed with all bands and stuff, and my entire identity was the bands that I liked, and because I was obsessed with music. I still love music, but just at a normal level, I think. But so I had my room would be completely plastered in bands, and all I wore was band tees, and I was obsessed with talking about the bands and putting my identity in them, always needing badges and merch and stuff, telling people the kind of music I was into, and just felt like that was my whole identity, really. And then something really changed when I went to church. I think it was November 2009 or something. Yeah, I really remember the preach. Really, it was called alternative security. That was the name of the preach, and it really kind of had a big impact on me, because it was about basically the preacher was saying, it was probably Joel Virgo. In fact, it was Joel Virgo. I love him and his work. But he was saying, the things you put in your identity in, are they eternal things? Can you take them with you? If you strip them away, what is left? And I realized, gosh, I'm really putting my identity in stuff that is completely, it's not, do you know what I mean? It's worthless at the end of the day. And there's an insecurity in it. It wasn't just oh, I love this music. It was I want you to know that I love this music. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that had a really big impact on me, and I started to reevaluate, what am I putting my identity in? And there was a long road of working out my identity. My identity.
Well, it's funny listening to all of this because you sound right now partially like a self-help guru.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the best of ways, because there's all this flip-flopping about that I'm part of with self-development, self-improvement, working on yourself.
Yeah.
And actually, I guess it's sort of that midwit meme of dumb person understands religion and Christian messaging, and then the midwit like me is obsessed with all this personal development and working on yourself and finding out why you should do good things and why you should actually not find your identity from a band that you like, but something that is core in you.
Yeah.
And then the other end is religion is good, therefore this.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating seeing the similarities between what you're saying as a Christian and all the self-improvement podcasts that I watch. But it just feels like it doesn't quite hit the same when it's a self-improvement podcast and people aren't embracing it the same way as you are. And I guess that leads to the question of if we could ever build these principles into our society if it's secular. Do you think that's possible, or do you have to have that divine fear?
Well, we're seeing the outworking of trying to have those principles without the core, which is in the post-Christian West, let's say, the post-Christian Western project. So this, I mean, obviously we had this real foundation and hundreds of years of like Christian heritage, and then this last, best part of a century really, the whole thing kind of this experiment of deconstructing it, which, actually Peter Hitchens wrote a great book about it called The Rage Against God, which he kind of details the the rotten bricks in the sense of things that happened over the last century really that eroded the authority of the church and people's faith in the church, and he talks about the church as like a proxy to God. But so there was this kind of disheartening effect of, like, especially through the wars and then through a few other scandals where people kind of lost their faith, and then you get the 60s coming along and the kind of sexual revolution, and from that this kind of, well, if we assume that we've rejected Christianity, then we need to unpick all of the things that are left from Christianity and in our society, all the norms about, sexual behavior, all the norms about, abortion, all the norms about, sexual expression, all the norms about marriage, just anything, drinking, drugs, vices, like basically all these things that had been assumed as bad 100 years ago, and which obviously makes sense from their perspective, that they should do that if, like, we don't believe in God. But then what you see is, as people like Alex O'Connor, the legend that we both the real AOC, yeah, big fans. We'll point out, the people we're living in this kind of post-Christian place where the new atheism movement, of which he was a part, but people like Dawkins and Sam Harris, they expected that if we could clear this stuff out of society, that it would that everything would be wonderful. And actually what you've seen is that just this complete descent into a kind of truthless, it's like where we can define our own truth and we can define who we are, we can redefine man and woman, and just literally if you're taking it back even to the core, like, of something that you could say is objective, like up and down, man and woman, you can't find something that's more kind of biologically based, truth based, clear than man and woman, really. And so to get to that point where it's like, well, these things are just a state of mind, this complete stripping away of all truth, that's the problem that you end up in. And without God, it is very hard to, I mean, obviously you could just say, okay, well, if I steel manned the kind of secular way of looking at it, I could say, well, we can still rely on the biological realities of life and call that out our firm foundation, like, you know, there are men and women and stuff, which is why you don't have to be religious to you know, be gender critical. I think.
Bigger.
Yeah, I know. But, you know, really, if you're going to boil it down to a merely materialistic lens, again, you have a real problem with human rights, the sanctity of human life, why we shouldn't just have a survival of the fittest sort of animal society where we're running around, you know, killing and attacking and assaulting one another and impregnating women against their will, trying to not use the R word. But you know what I mean? Like if we have got this purely biological evolutionary perspective that we're just animals, if that's going to be the bedrock truth, that leaves us in a very anarchistic, is that the word?
Yeah.
Society.
It's so difficult because I completely get what you're saying, but I still don't believe in God.
Yeah.
And it brings up this question that I have to be able to answer, which is, do we basically as humans have to then believe in these things that aren't true to flourish?
From your perspective, true, right, okay, yeah.
And it's a difficult
can I
question.
just stop you there for a second?
Mm-hmm.
You've just said that these things are required for flourishing, but they're not true. And I would say, is there not a part of you that thinks because it causes flourishing, that might be another indicator that it's true? As a part, like we look at communism, we say communism's evil, but apart from the fact it's not just evil, you know, it doesn't actually work. It can't work because of the nature of human beings. They're selfish and people become corrupted and all this stuff. We know that it never works and it always ends in bloodshed. You could say, well, okay, whether or not it's good, it doesn't work. So we can at least say that doesn't work as an idea. But I think the evidence is that when we live according to God's teachings, follow Christ, then we do have a society that has these great outcomes.
But do we, because communism was tried and it doesn't work because it goes against the truths you see it in humanity. So,
and you see it. That's what you think as well, isn't it?
Sure. And it collapses very quickly.
For real.
But we've been living in religious societies and there were still things going wrong always. So what's to say that it's not the case that the same thing's going to happen as with communism, that actually the religious beliefs that we buy into aren't true either? It's just taking longer for the society to collapse.
So are you saying that, so when you say things are still going wrong in Christian societies, which is obviously true because we're not perfect, what sort of things are you talking about? Well,
especially even when society was more religious, things like slavery and everything that we can list off.
Yeah.
What's to say that communism is it's a very easy thing to look into because you've got communist Russia, starts in 1917, then collapses 1991.
Yeah.
What's to say that it's not the same thing that's happening with the West? I mean, we're not in a good place.
Yeah.
Are we not just going to collapse? And then that shows that the teachings of religion aren't true either. It just took longer because they were closer to the truth, and we'll find something else that is true. And who knows, maybe it's atheist.
Well, I think to the extent that we have followed God in our institutions, then you have seen thriving. The reason we're in the state that we're in now is because it's post-Christian, is because it's let's replace Christian morality with sort of some kind of strange progressive morality.
But the question is, was it thriving before it was post-Christian? Or were there kings sitting on their fat asses with all the money of the country while the peasants suffered?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is if you want to judge a country by, you know, say, oh, it's a Christian country, you have to look at how Christian it is. So, for example, let's say you do have a king sitting on a throne and peasants doing everything. My question would be, is that because of Christianity? Or are they failing to live up to their Christian standards?
So when do you think was the most Christian time in British history?
You'll have to ask Starkey that or something.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see when was actually the most Christian time in history, and not just the whole country's Christian because they have to be or they get executed, as in people actually living by Christian values.
Yeah.
And then comparing the flourishing to that. Yeah. And it should correlate, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of people that would be good to talk to about that, like Tom Holland or, you know, Stephen Blackwood or whatever. You know, but you do see the manifestation of, so it was Christians that started, obviously now we say schools and that, hospitals, those are state things. But, the orphanages, the schools, the hospitals generally came out of, Christian charities, Christian endeavours, things like that. Again, it's this, and not just like Chrysos who were just like, didn't know what to do, or they were just affluent, so they decided to do that, but like genuine sacrifice and for Christian reasons. And we also have the heritage that we see and enjoy all the time, and that we mourn the loss of, in terms of Christian art, Christian music, you think about the Messiah, Handel's Messiah, or something stunning like that. These beautiful pieces of art that lift one's gaze higher to something more beautiful.
One's gaze.
And so it's not just practical things like good outcomes, like better provision for the poor. You wouldn't believe, I don't know if you've read the Bible, but just the amount of verses in the Bible about making sure that the poor are looked after, making sure that it often talks about the widowed, the orphan, the fatherless, the sojourner, the foreigner, the kind of person amongst you who is poor. The amount of emphasis in the New and the Old Testament from God, I'm like, you really need to make sure you're looking after the poor in society. So a lot of these things, they're not just incidental. The fact that we value looking after the poor people in our society does derive explicitly from Christianity. And so I'd say that a lot of the things that people are really sad about now, that they feel like they're losing in the West, are, broadly speaking, from Christianity. I don't know what you think about that. What I'm saying is this is an indicator, for me anyway. It's not proof that the Bible's real, or that it's not proof that God exists, but it's certainly a supporting thing that at least it's not going against it. At least it's not absolutely failing, like, saying, well, this doesn't actually work, because it actually does work. But you'll have to ask a historian about exactly when that was all kicking off.
So to tie all of this together, it's quite a horrible note to end on, but I think it's really important because I don't just want to sell people a myth. I want to seek after the truth.
Yeah.
And it's something that we've discussed time and time again, and it's important that you keep on telling me this. And that's that some people will live the most moral of lives.
Yeah.
No rotten bricks, as far as that's even possible. They'll have a great family. They'll provide for them. They'll give to charities. They'll never lie as little as possible. And after all of that, they'll still die, and they'll die a horrible death. I've been filming with Chris Williamson this week. I won't say the guest, but they were talking about having self-agency. And one of the things they were discussing was this guy who had exactly that. And the final 3 words that his wife, or the 3 words that his wife said to his son after he died, was, he died screaming. After everything he'd done in his life that was so good. Then on the other hand, you'll have someone that's corrupt, that lies, that does everything to build their empire instead of God's empire, if I put it in your terms. And they'll live a wonderful life. They'll reach the top. They'll be famous. They'll be rich. They'll get a smoking hot wife, and they'll drive a fucking Bugatti. And that's just the case, isn't it? That even if you do everything to the best of your ability morally, you might live a shit life, or at least die a horrible death. And the person that goes against all of that might still in their lifetime thrive.
Yeah.
What do you think to that?
Well, I don't think that's not a surprise to me, or a surprise to the Bible, in the sense that you see that all the way through Scripture. There's Psalms all about that. There's a Psalm, I think it's Psalm 37, or is it 73? Let's go with 37. But the whole Psalm is basically the psalmist being like, what the hell, God? Like, why do people, like, who are corrupt, get like rich and have all this ease, and they have everything good, and they're just evil through and through, but yet, they seem to, do well in this life. And why is it that good people that do good things, suffer? I mean, but there's a lot of people that for whom that is true. That's not like an analogy. That's not like, so this person you talked about, who died screaming or whatever, like, there are lots of people to whom that happens. So we have to be, you have to be careful about it, because you can't just, I don't want to talk about it glibly, because there are people around the world like that. There are also, I think that's what happened to the vast majority of the people in, like, well, pretty much all of Jesus' disciples, apart from John, I think, were all kind of martyred. They all died, probably, maybe screaming. I mean, boiled alive, crucified upside down, things like that. And obviously there have been martyrs throughout history. There's one that's just down the road from in Lewis, Derek Carver, who was martyred in 1555 for, was he burnt at the stake for, I think, maybe translating the Bible, something like that. But so bad things do happen to good people, and good things do happen to bad people. I guess that is the question like why that would be the case?
Well, I guess it's something that I think a lot of people my age maybe ask.
Right.
And the problem of evil with, if
Suffering.
God was omniscient, why does he let suffering happen?
Yeah.
Is very much the top reason for why someone wouldn't believe in religion.
Right,
and
okay.
In that tact, people look around and they see liars, they see people that are corrupt succeeding.
Yeah.
So the question is, why shouldn't I do what they're doing if I'm living this horrible life and I'm not an influencer in Bali?
Right, okay.
But
right.
They are.
Right, okay. I guess that Christians would say that nothing escapes God, that people don't get away with anything. These corrupt people, that are choosing evil, that are exploiting people, that are causing others to suffer, will be held accountable for that before God. We all will, actually, for all of our sin, without Christ. And so there is something in that helps the Christian to say, look, I'm not going to take vengeance on people. I'm not going to sin myself because I'm so angry at this person who has sinned, because God will deal with that. So I mean, that's a Christian idea, obviously, turn the other cheek and vengeance belonging to God. But actually, I think that I'm getting off track here, because I don't think this is what you're talking about. I think you're probably just talking about suffering in general, like, why does God allow suffering? Which this is the last question of the interview. You've just thrown me the biggest philosophical question of all time. But the question of suffering is that, and I don't want to give a glib answer, but I think that you probably know what I'm going to say, which is that that God uses everything for good, and we don't know the reasons that God has planned. I've got a very close friend who, one of my best friends actually, who got married, and 4 months into their marriage, their wife was struck down with a really serious illness, and since then he's been her carer for like 30 years, which was not what he had expected to happen. I think they spent maybe I think it was cumulatively 10 years in hospital, in and out of hospital. And lots of issues, lots of physical issues, but lots of mental issues. And you could say, well, that's not, when you're young and you're in your early 20s and you get married and your wife is the life and soul of the party and you're just loving it, and just a new Christian as well. He'd just become a Christian and she was a Christian, and then you're just smacked with this thing that's like a long suffering issue. And anyone looking at that situation could be like, that's kind of a worst case scenario, because people say, well, if you lost your wife, at least you might mourn for a few years, but then you can move on. Whereas this is like you've basically become a carer. But, you know, when you actually spend time with this man and you've met him, and he's very dear to me, but the wisdom and the grace and the love and the compassion and the care that comes from him, that he has learned through that time of suffering in looking after his wife, inspires everyone that meets him. And everyone is just really in awe. And I would say, like, you know, I can't say this lightly, but I do think he's probably the most Christ-like person I've met, like, because he's walked through that long suffering. And he could turn around and say, you know, the flesh within him, the flesh is the kind of what Christians would call the sinful nature within him, could say, I didn't sign up for this. And, you know, 99% of men would either check out, like just leave, or check out emotionally. So they would either just kind of go through the motions, but not actually be there, or like drown their sorrows in something else, or their hobbies, or going out, or whatever. But he hasn't done that, and he's committed to walking in a Christ-like way through that. And I just see so much beauty in that. I just see so much honor in that, and so much goodness. And I just think these things, when you talk to people who've really suffered, I imagine if you talk to people who have this real great love and care within them, that they'll have been through some proper suffering. Like, people I know that have been through lots of suffering, some of the most amazing, loving Christians who like serve amazingly and wholeheartedly and make the world a better place, you know, have gone through a lot of suffering. And I think this idea of, I think we can be quite, that's not to say that it's not insanely hard when you're in it. And I'm not saying, people should just suck it up because it's all going to come good. But I think the most beautiful things in life do come out of a precious place of suffering. And so that's probably the best argument. It's not an argument, but it's probably the best I can do, because we are running out of time, and I know that. So yeah, I don't want to treat it like in a glib way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I think there's something really precious and also really spiritually deep about suffering that can be, just amazing.
Yeah, we need a full 4-hour Joe Rogan style pod on this, but just to have it added in so that I've said it for people my age, I've worked in these industries where there are people that are absolutely worshipped as gods, and the ones that I see that are happy are the ones that do tell the truth and do things not to build up their own empire, but, as you would put it, God's empire, as I would put it, just acting morally. And the ones that you think are happy, but they're corrupt, and that's the way they got to power, they're not fucking happy. So to put the final secular spin on it, even if you listen to this and you think, okay, well, some people do die miserable deaths when they did everything right, or live horrible lives when they did everything right, and people succeed, but they do that through the means of corruption. No, they don't. Like 99.99% of the time, that's not the case. It's just worth being aware that still there is an option that might happen. Yeah. But Sophie Spital, thank you so much for coming on The Next Generation. Babe. Where can people check out your stuff? Yeah, well, I've got a Substack, which is just my name, Sophie Spital, Spital, like hospital without the ho. So I've got Substack, Twitter, I think an Instagram, but I don't really use it much, but I probably should. But yeah, stuff on there. And we didn't touch on it at all, but on my Substack, I've written an article explaining, just shove it in at the end, my experience of having gender dysphoria and autism, and working through that, like gender confusion that I had when I was younger. And so I do quite a lot of speaking about that, and events and conferences about that. So that content is online. You have to get a bit of trans in there.
Yeah, I had to get a bit of trans
rude
in
not
there.
to.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. And also, yeah, I was also interviewed on TRIGGERnometry about a year or so ago. So, yeah, that awkward interview's out there with the funny.
That was brilliant.
Thank you for the thumbnails. The thumbnails are funny. But yeah.